What would you do if the man who gave you life, the father whose approval you've spent years chasing, stood before the world and declared that you were no longer his son? That's not just a hypothetical. That's the brutal reality that Prince Harry faced when King Charles made the unthinkable decision to disown him, cutting him off not just from the privileges of the monarchy, but from the very bloodline that defined him. And as Harry collapsed under the weight of that announcement, the entire world looked on, stunned, horrified, and yet unable to turn away. Think about it for a moment. A royal disownment isn't just a private family matter. It's a global spectacle. The House of Windsor isn't like your family or mine. When they tear themselves apart, history gets rewritten, dynasties tremble, and entire nations watch in disbelief. But why now? Why would King Charles, after years of scandal, negotiation, and carefully worded statements, finally cut his own son adrift? And what exactly did Harry hear in that palace announcement that made his legs give way beneath him? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This is where the story begins, not in quiet whispers or behind gilded palace doors, but with a thunderclap that shook the monarchy to its core. You see, this wasn't just about removing titles or cutting financial ties. This was about stripping Harry of identity itself. The official statement didn't just mention a distancing. It declared in cold, unambiguous language that Harry was no longer recognized as a member of the royal family. Imagine hearing that, not in private, but in front of cameras, the world's press, and billions of people who had grown up watching your every move. And here's the twist that makes it even more chilling. The announcement wasn't spontaneous. It was deliberate, rehearsed, and backed by forces inside the palace that had been building toward this moment for years. If you think this was just about family issues, you'd be wrong. This was about control, about legacy, and about silencing someone who had become too unpredictable, too rebellious, and far too dangerous to the carefully maintained image of the crown. Let's pause for a moment. Do you remember how the world reacted when Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back from royal duties in 2020? Headlines screamed Megxit, commentators raged, and the palace scrambled to contain the fallout. That was child's play compared to this. Back then, Harry was still technically a prince of the realm, still the son of the future king, still tethered, if tenuously, to the institution. But with this announcement, that tether snapped. This was exile not by choice, but by decree. Now, picture the scene in your mind. The palace staff gather the press. Cameras are fixed, microphones poised. A statement is read, not with warmth, not with regret, but with the icy formality of monarchy. Every word is carefully chosen, every phrase calculated. And there's Harry, learning, just as the rest of the world is learning, that he is no longer part of the family he was born into. His reaction? Collapse. Physically, emotionally, spiritually. A man undone in front of billions. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because what Charles said, and the way he said it, wasn't just about severing ties. It was about rewriting history. By declaring Harry no longer recognized, Charles sent a message not only to Harry but to the entire world. Bloodlines, loyalty, even love are secondary to the survival of the monarchy. And if that means disowning your son, so be it. So the question is, what pushed Charles to that breaking point? Was it Harry's public criticisms of the family? His tell-all memoir? The Netflix deals, the interviews, the raw accusations of racism, neglect, and cruelty? Or was there something deeper, something hidden in the palace corridors, whispered only among courtiers, and locked away in files the public will never see? That's what makes this story so explosive. It isn't just about what was said in the announcement. It's about everything that led up to it. The years of feuding, the quiet backstabbing, the long-simmering resentments between father and son. The palace had options: quietly freeze him out, keep him on the periphery, let him fade into irrelevance. But instead, they chose the nuclear option. Public disownment. The symbolic killing of a son. And Harry's collapse? That wasn't just a moment of shock. It was a lifetime of wounds tearing open all at once. From the loss of his mother, Princess Diana, to the constant scrutiny of the press, to the simmering rivalries with William, Harry has always been the royal most at odds with the institution that raised him. And now, with one cold statement, every fracture in his life widened into a chasm. Ask yourself this: How does a man recover from that? How does anyone survive being cut off, not just financially or socially, but in identity? To be told, in essence, you no longer belong? For Harry, it wasn't just a statement. It was annihilation. And yet, the announcement wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Because once those words were spoken, the ripple effects were unstoppable. The media frenzy, Meghan's fury, William's silence, and Charles's own cold resolve. All of it fed into a narrative that would spiral out of control. But here's where it gets darker. Because sources whisper that the palace had been preparing this move for months, if not years. There were files, sealed communications, secret discussions about what to do with Harry if he continued to go rogue. And when those preparations culminated in the announcement, it wasn't just an act of punishment. It was an act of war. So where does that leave us? At the start of a story that's bigger than Harry, bigger than Charles, bigger than the monarchy itself. A story about power, betrayal, survival, and the human cost of a crown that refuses to bend. Because if the palace can erase Harry, the so-called spare, with a single statement, who's safe? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It all began with a single sentence. A sentence so cold, so stripped of emotion, that it sent shockwaves through the world before people even had time to process what it meant. The palace statement, delivered with the stiff formality of centuries of royal protocol, didn't say Prince Harry has chosen to step back. It didn't say Harry is pursuing a different path. No, what it said was final, brutal, and merciless. Prince Harry was no longer recognized as part of the royal family. Imagine the silence that followed those words. The cameras captured the moment. Reporters sat stunned. Even seasoned royal commentators who had seen scandal after scandal were left speechless. A line had been crossed. A boundary shattered. This wasn't suspension. This wasn't a temporary rift. This was disownment. A monarch disowning his son in front of the entire world. Now, why does that matter? Because the monarchy is built on image, continuity, and bloodlines. Blood is the very currency of royalty. And when the king himself severs that blood tie publicly, it shakes the foundation of the crown. For centuries, the Windsors have endured crises, abdications, divorces, scandals, but rarely has a reigning monarch drawn a line this stark, this unforgiving. And that's what made this statement so powerful. It wasn't just a political maneuver, it was a personal execution. But let's break it down, because the wording of the statement itself tells us everything we need to know. It didn't express regret. It didn't wish Harry well. It was legalistic, almost surgical. The palace used terms like no longer recognized, withdrawal of privileges, severed obligations. Every phrase was designed to make one thing crystal clear. Harry wasn't family anymore. He was an outsider, an exile. And here's where it gets even more chilling. The decision wasn't just about punishing Harry for his past actions. It was about controlling the narrative. The palace knew that Harry had become a loose cannon. Interviews with Oprah, the memoir Spare, Netflix documentaries, all filled with damning accusations. The king couldn't silence him outright. But by disowning him, by officially cutting him out, he reframed the story. Harry wasn't a victim of the crown. He was a castaway, discredited and discarded. Ask yourself this. What does it take for a father to declare his son no longer part of this family? Was Charles pushed to the edge by Harry's constant criticisms? Was it Meghan's presence, fueling tensions behind the scenes? Or was it the courtiers, the faceless advisors and strategists, whispering in his ear, warning that keeping Harry tethered to the crown was a risk too dangerous to tolerate? The statement didn't answer those questions. It left the world guessing, fueling endless speculation. And in the vacuum of clarity, narratives spun out of control. Some called it an act of necessity. Others branded it cruelty. And a few even whispered about darker motivations, that this wasn't about protecting the monarchy at all, but about settling old scores buried deep in the Windsor bloodline. But what made the moment unforgettable wasn't just the words. It was Harry's reaction. Because while the statement was read with icy detachment, Harry was hearing it at the same time as the rest of us. There was no private conversation beforehand, no chance to prepare. For Harry, those words weren't just protocol. They were a dagger to the heart. And in that instant, as his body buckled under the weight of rejection, the palace might have thought it had won. That by making the break public, it would neutralize the threat. But what they underestimated was the ripple effect. Because the world didn't just hear Charles's words, they saw Harry collapse. And that collapse told a story louder than any official statement could. Here's the irony. In trying to erase Harry, the palace immortalized him. His collapse became the image replayed on every news channel, splashed across every headline. The man they tried to silence was suddenly louder than ever, not through words, but through his brokenness. And if the palace believed this announcement would end speculation, they were wrong. Because almost immediately, questions began swirling about what was left unsaid. Why now? Why this moment? What secret files or conversations pushed Charles to the brink? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what did William, Camilla, and the rest of the royal family know in advance? One thing was certain. The statement wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of a war. A war fought not just in the press, but in whispers, leaks, and long-buried secrets that were about to surface. Because as the cameras cut away from that icy palace statement, behind the scenes, a storm was already brewing. And what that storm revealed would tear open wounds far deeper than anyone expected. But behind that carefully chosen wording lay a truth that rattled Harry to his core, and it was about to come out. He collapsed, not in the metaphorical sense, not just emotionally. Prince Harry's body gave way beneath him, as though the weight of his father's words had slammed down like a hammer against his chest. Witnesses described it as a chilling, almost surreal moment. One second he was standing tall, his face tense with the strain of anticipation, and the next, his knees buckled, his arms reaching for balance that wasn't there, his frame crumpling as aides rushed forward. What does it mean when a man who has faced combat zones, frontline danger, and the relentless flash of the paparazzi can no longer stand under the burden of his own family's rejection? That collapse was more than physical exhaustion. It was symbolic. It was the breaking of a man who, despite all his rebellions, still clung to the hope of reconciliation. A man who believed, deep down, that even through the chaos, his father's love would anchor him. But in that instant, all of it shattered. Think about it. Harry has endured loss before. The death of Diana, the cold indifference of palace life, the brutal tabloid machine. He's walked behind his mother's coffin with the eyes of millions drilling into his grief-stricken face. He's been mocked, belittled, painted as the spare, the shadow standing forever in William's light. And yet, through it all, he held on. But this was different. This wasn't tragedy imposed by fate. This was betrayal orchestrated by blood. Onlookers gasped. Meghan's face, they say, turned ashen as she lurched toward her husband, caught between fury and helplessness. Some aides froze, unsure whether to shield Harry from cameras or let the world see the raw consequence of the monarchy's cruelty. Others moved quickly, steadying him, whispering frantic reassurances that sounded hollow even as they left their lips. Because everyone in that room knew, nothing could undo what had just been said. And yet, here's the contradiction. The collapse only magnified the moment. Instead of reducing Harry to a forgotten footnote, it transformed him into a tragic figure. His physical collapse told the story no palace statement could silence. This wasn't just a formal disownment. It was a human devastation. It was a son being cast out by his father, and the entire world saw his body scream what his lips could not. Let me ask you, if your father publicly declared that you were no longer part of the family, would you crumble? Or would you fight? Would you rage against the betrayal, or sink under the weight of grief? For Harry, it seemed, for a brief, heartbreaking instant, that the fight had gone out of him. His collapse wasn't just a loss of balance, it was the loss of belief. Belief that reconciliation was possible. Belief that the monarchy still held room for him. Belief that Charles could ever see him as more than a liability. Now, palace insiders whisper that the collapse rattled even some of the royals watching. They had prepared for anger. They had prepared for fury. They had even prepared for Harry to storm out. But they had not prepared for him to fall. That moment pierced through the stiff armor of royal protocol and exposed the brutal truth. This wasn't just politics. This was blood and bone breaking apart. And the echoes of Diana were everywhere. Think about it. Harry on the floor, undone by the monarchy's coldness. Was it not a mirror of his mother, who herself had been discarded, humiliated, and destroyed by the same institution? Some watching swore they felt history repeating itself. The son who had vowed to protect Diana's memory, collapsing in the shadow of her fate. But here's where it turns darker. Because palace sources suggest that some courtiers saw the collapse not as a tragedy, but as vindication. To them, it proved their narrative, that Harry was unstable, fragile, unfit for the demands of royal life. In their cold calculations, his collapse didn't damage the monarchy, it strengthened it. It painted him as the weak link who had to be cut away. Can you see the cruelty of it? A man destroyed in plain sight, and yet his very destruction twisted into ammunition against him. It's the kind of irony that would make Shakespeare weep. And Meghan? Her anguish that day was undeniable. She reached for Harry, shielded him, her voice sharp and furious as she demanded space. For her, the collapse was both a personal crisis and a public vindication of everything she had warned about. The palace's indifference, its brutality, its willingness to sacrifice flesh and blood for image. But even she, for all her outrage, couldn't reverse the reality that hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The collapse was the image the world replayed, the clip that went viral, the symbol of everything rotten in the Windsor legacy. And while Charles's words may have been rehearsed, polished, and deliberate, Harry's collapse was raw, unscripted, undeniable. It was truth, laid bare in the most human way possible. But here's the twist. Harry's collapse didn't end the moment. It opened the door to a darker realization. Because as he was lifted up, steadied, and carried away from the spotlight, whispers began to surface about why Charles had chosen that exact day, that exact phrasing, that exact moment to strike. And that's when the world began to realize this wasn't just about Harry's choices. This was about years of festering resentment within the family itself. A rift so deep, so bitter, that the collapse wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Because behind that fall lay a trail of betrayals that stretched back decades. And the family rift that had long been whispered about was finally, brutally, laid bare. A royal family fracture doesn't happen overnight. It brews. It festers. It builds in whispers, in icy silences at dinner tables, in side glances during public appearances. And when it finally explodes, it doesn't just wound, it devastates. That's what happened here. The statement disowning Harry wasn't born from a single disagreement. It was the culmination of years, decades even, of unresolved bitterness, hidden power struggles, and unspoken betrayals. Let's strip away the royal glitter for a moment. At its core, this is a story of a family tearing itself apart. A father and son divided not just by politics, but by pain. Two brothers, once inseparable, now standing on opposite sides of a battlefield neither of them chose, but both of them helped ignite. And hovering over it all is the monarchy itself, an institution demanding obedience, demanding sacrifice, demanding that love always bend to duty. So where did this rift really begin? Some would argue it started the day Diana died. The boys were united in grief, but the way they were shaped by that grief diverged. William, the heir, was folded deeper into the machinery of the crown. He was reminded daily that one day he would be king, that his emotions were secondary to the survival of the monarchy. Harry, on the other hand, was left adrift. They spare, with no clear role, no defined future, carrying the same grief, but without the crown's safety net. Two paths born from the same tragedy, and yet destined to collide. Think about it. Every family has rivalries, but in the House of Windsor, rivalry becomes destiny. William was groomed for duty. Harry was left searching for identity. And as they grew, so did the resentment. William, resentful of Harry's freedom. Harry, resentful of William's protection. That imbalance simmered for years, hidden behind staged smiles and choreographed appearances. But the cracks were always there. And then Meghan entered the picture. Suddenly, Harry wasn't just the spare. He was a man in love, ready to defend his wife against the same forces that had destroyed his mother. Meghan represented everything the palace despised: independence, refusal to bow, the audacity to speak out. And for William, who had long carried the burden of silence, it was infuriating to watch his younger brother break free from the chains he himself had quietly endured. The rift deepened. William and Kate saw Harry and Meghan as reckless, disruptive, a threat to the monarchy's delicate balance. Harry and Meghan saw William and Kate as cold, complicit, willing to let history repeat itself. And Charles, caught in the middle, but leaning, always, toward the crown's survival over his son's happiness. The dissonant statement wasn't the start of the feud. It was the palace putting into words what the family had already lived for years. The tension had boiled in private arguments, frosty Christmas gatherings, and passive-aggressive press briefings. Every headline about royal sources was really just a coded attack. Brothers briefing against brothers, aides weaponizing leaks, family members cutting each other with words while smiling for cameras. Let me ask you this. Have you ever had a falling out with a sibling? Imagine it multiplied by billions of eyes, every argument dissected by the press, every silence read as strategy, every smile forced into symbolism. That's the Windsor reality. And in Harry's collapse, in Charles's brutal announcement, the world finally saw the rift that had been carefully hidden behind palace walls. But here's the tragic irony. Diana had warned about this very outcome. She spoke of an institution cold to compassion, ruthless to individuality. She predicted that her sons would face battles not just with the press, but with the crown itself. And now, decades later, her prophecy has come true in the cruelest way possible. Her boys, once united in grief, torn apart by the very system she fought against. The collapse wasn't just about Harry's personal pain. It was about a dynasty splintering in plain sight. It was William watching, unable, or unwilling, to step in. It was Anne, stoic and unforgiving, muttering that Harry had brought it upon himself. It was Camilla, silent but satisfied, seeing her stepson's influence crumble. And it was Charles, the father who chose crown over child, finally revealing where his loyalties truly lay. But here's where it gets darker. Because palace insiders whisper that this wasn't just about family drama. This was about documents, files, evidence of Harry's betrayals collected and cataloged by palace officials, ready to be unleashed if necessary. And when Charles signed off on the dissolution, those files weren't just background, they were ammunition. Proof that Harry had crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. So, while the world saw a father casting out his son, behind the scenes, the truth was even more sinister. The rift wasn't just emotional, it was institutional. The palace wasn't reacting to Harry's collapse. They were prepared for it. They wanted it. They engineered it. Because in their eyes, the rift wasn't a tragedy, it was a strategy. And that strategy would soon be revealed in a way no one expected. Because buried deep in those secret palace files was something so explosive, so devastating, that Harry's collapse would pale in comparison. And once those files began to surface, the world would understand that the rift wasn't just about family. It was about survival. But the real betrayal was yet to surface, hidden in dusty royal files. There are whispers inside every palace. Rumors that slither through corridors, carried by servants, aides, and advisors who know too much but speak too little. For years, whispers followed Harry. Whispers of arguments, of betrayal, of choices that endangered the monarchy. But when Charles officially disowned him, people began asking, what was the real trigger? What pushed a father, a king, to sever blood ties in public? The answer, according to insiders, lay in files, confidential, meticulously kept, and buried in the shadows of the institution. Files that held the receipts of Harry's rebellion. Picture it. Vast filing cabinets deep in Buckingham Palace, locked away from public eyes. Each folder labeled, each page documenting every misstep, every conversation, every breach of protocol. The royals keep records. They always have. Every scandal is archived, every letter preserved. For Harry, those files became a weapon, a dossier of his life, his choices, his secrets, gathered and prepared for the day the palace might have to strike. That day came, and the files were opened. But what could be in them? Financial leaks? Emails? Private conversations with aides? Some sources claim the files held records of Harry's private dealings with the press, the very institution he claimed to despise. Deals made to shape his image, to shield Meghan, even if it meant briefing against other royals. Could you imagine? Harry, who declared war on the tabloids, secretly feeding them when it suited him. If true, it would make him a hypocrite in the eyes of the monarchy, and worse, a liability. And yet, others insist the files went deeper, that they contained correspondence between Harry and senior politicians in America. requests for influence, lobbying, a backchannel of power that blurred the line between private citizen and royal prince. To the monarchy, that was dangerous. A royal stepping into politics is a red line, and Harry may have crossed it. Still others whisper that the files contained personal betrayals, notes from private family meetings, audio recordings, the kind of raw, emotional material that could destroy trust forever. Think of it. Words spoken in confidence, locked away in transcripts, later used as evidence against him. And the worst part? He may not have even known he was being recorded. Now let me ask you this. If you discovered your family had been building a case against you for years, documenting your every mistake, waiting for the right moment to unleash it, how would you react? Would you fight? Would you collapse? Would you feel betrayed beyond repair? For Harry, those files were proof that the rift wasn't just emotional. It was orchestrated, planned, executed with precision. Here's where it gets darker still. Because palace insiders suggest those files didn't just implicate Harry. They implicated Meghan. Notes about her clashes with staff, her alleged disrespect of protocol, her influence over Harry. Every rumor, every accusation, bound into pages that could be released or weaponized at any moment. And when the palace finally made the announcement disowning Harry, those files became the silent justification. They didn't need to reveal the details. The mere suggestion that evidence existed was enough to sway public opinion. But consider this contradiction. If the files truly contained devastating evidence, why not release them outright? Why keep them hidden, mentioned only in whispers? The answer is simple. Because secrecy is more powerful. When people don't know what's inside, their imagination does the work. Every critic of Harry fills in the blanks with their worst suspicions. Every supporter fears the files could contain something catastrophic. And Harry himself, left to wonder what was written about him, what betrayals had been catalogued, was broken by the not knowing. And that is the palace's strategy. Don't reveal, suggest, threaten, keep the files under lock and key, but let it be known they exist. It's psychological warfare, a constant reminder that they hold the power, that they hold the narrative, that they hold his life in their hands. But here's the twist. What if the files also contained something that could damage Charles, or William, or the monarchy itself? Imagine if, in their eagerness to track Harry's rebellions, they accidentally revealed their own sins. Conversations about Diana, discussions of cover-ups, evidence of favoritism, manipulation, maybe even corruption. What if those files weren't just Harry's undoing, but the Crown's? This is why the files matter. They're not just dusty papers in a drawer. They're the hidden battlefield of this war. And the very fact that their existence has leaked tells us something crucial. Someone inside the palace wants the world to know they exist. Someone wants Harry, and the world, to feel that threat hanging overhead. And it worked. Because when Harry collapsed after the announcement, it wasn't just grief. It was the crushing weight of those files pressing down on him. The knowledge that his own family had been keeping score, keeping secrets, keeping receipts. That betrayal, more than the words themselves, is what shattered him. But if you think Meghan took this lying down, think again. Because for her, the files weren't just evidence of betrayal. They were ammunition. And Meghan's fury was about to explode in a way that would leave the palace scrambling. But Meghan's next move would shock even Harry himself. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't even flinch. Meghan Markle stood like a pillar of fire, her eyes burning with a fury that could cut glass. While Harry crumpled under the crushing blow of his father's announcement, Meghan's anger crystallized into something sharp, something dangerous. For years, she had warned him. For years, she had said that this family, this institution, would devour him the way it devoured his mother. And now, as King Charles disowned his son before the eyes of the world, Meghan's worst fears were realized. Imagine the scene. Harry on the ground, aides fluttering around him, cameras capturing every second of humiliation. And Meghan, jaw tight, hands clenched, her entire body vibrating with rage. Witnesses say she hissed at staff to back off, shielding her husband like a lioness protecting her cub. For her, this wasn't just a family feud. This was war. But here's the question. What role did Meghan play in the years leading up to this? Was she the victim, dragged into a centuries-old system of cruelty and betrayal? Or was she, as palace insiders whisper, the spark that lit the fuse? Let's be clear, Meghan's arrival into the royal family was a seismic shock. An outsider, American, biracial, divorced, an actress with her own voice and her own opinions. To the monarchy, she was everything they weren't. And from day one, she refused to play by their rules. The tension started small. Clashes with palace staff. Rumors of demands that defied protocol. Questions about her refusal to know her place. Every move she made was dissected, criticized, twisted. And Harry, who had always bristled against royal constraints, found in Meghan not just a partner, but an ally. She gave him something the crown never had, freedom. And that terrified the palace. Here's the contradiction. Meghan was both Harry's salvation and his downfall. With her, he found love, independence, and courage to speak against the crown. But with her also came a new level of hostility from within the palace walls. William and Kate viewed her as disruptive. Charles saw her as manipulative. And Camilla? Some say she saw Meghan as Diana 2.0, a threat to stability, a woman capable of winning the public's heart and exposing the monarchy's cracks. So when Harry chose Meghan over the institution, the palace never forgave him. The files collected against him weren't just about Harry, they were about her. Complaints from staff. Notes about protocol breaches. Accusations of bullying that Meghan always denied, but that were whispered endlessly in the corridors of power. And when the time came to strike, Charles didn't just disown Harry. He was cutting Meghan out too, silencing her influence once and for all. But Meghan doesn't scare easily. In fact, the announcement only made her more dangerous. Because Meghan knows something the palace doesn't: how to control the modern narrative. She understands media, brand, and public opinion in ways the Windsors never will. They fight with secrecy and silence. She fights with visibility and voice. And in the wake of Harry's collapse, Meghan began strategizing. Ask yourself, what happens when a woman who has been vilified, mocked, and silenced suddenly has nothing left to lose? Meghan had already endured the relentless storm of the British tabloids, the cold hostility of the palace, and the crushing weight of racism and misogyny hurled her way. Now, with her husband disowned, she had one mission: to fight back. Not quietly, not subtly, but publicly. Sources close to the couple claim Meghan demanded immediate action. She told Harry they couldn't wait, couldn't retreat into silence. That every second they stayed quiet, the palace narrative hardened. And so, behind closed doors, Meghan began drafting statements, reaching out to allies in Hollywood, and preparing for the media counterstrike of the century. Because in her mind, the palace hadn't just attacked Harry. They had attacked her, her children, and the very future she was trying to build. But here's where the story twists. Because while Meghan's rage was directed at Charles and the institution, Harry wasn't so sure. Collapsed, broken, and drowning in betrayal, he wondered if his wife's presence had been the final straw. Had her influence, her defiance, been the reason his father finally cut him off? That doubt festered. And Meghan, sensing it, became more determined to prove that she wasn't the problem, she was the solution. Let me ask you, in that moment, who had more power? The king on his throne, declaring his son erased? Or the woman standing tall beside her collapsed husband, refusing to let the world see her break? History will judge differently. But in that moment, Meghan's role was undeniable. She was no longer just Harry's wife. She was his shield, his strategist, and his only ally in a war where even his brother had gone silent. And yet, that silence from William spoke volumes. Because while Meghan prepared her counterattack, William's decision to stand back would rip the rift even wider. When William finally spoke, it wasn't to defend Harry. William stood frozen, watching it all unfold. His younger brother, once his closest companion, the boy who had shared his grief, his laughter, and his secrets, was now lying collapsed, broken in front of the world. And yet William said nothing. His lips didn't move, his hands didn't reach out, his face betrayed nothing but the steel resolve drilled into him since childhood. Because William wasn't just a brother anymore. He was the heir, and heirs cannot waver. But let's be honest, silence speaks louder than words. And William's silence screamed of a conflict raging inside him. Was he torn between loyalty to his brother and duty to the crown? Or had the years of bitterness hardened him, leaving little room for compassion? Because the William who once clung to Harry in the darkness after Diana's death was gone. In his place stood a man weighed down by destiny, shackled by responsibility, and unwilling to risk it all for the brother who had chosen love over loyalty. Think back to their childhood. The two boys inseparable, raised in the gilded cage of Kensington Palace. After Diana's passing, it was Harry who made William laugh again, Harry who dragged him out of despair, Harry who reminded him that they were more than pawns of the institution. And for years, they were a team. But slowly, that team fractured. William, groomed for kingship, began to see duty as survival. Harry, restless and rebellious, began to see duty as a prison. The divergence was inevitable, and Meghan only widened the gap. William saw her as an interloper, someone who pulled Harry away from the family, away from tradition, away from him. Their once unshakable bond turned brittle. Every decision Harry made seemed to William a betrayal of the crown, and by extension, a betrayal of him. So when Charles delivered the devastating announcement, William knew he had a choice. He could step forward, break the silence, defend his brother, and risk being seen as weak, divided, unfit to wear the crown. Or he could stand firm, keep his distance, and prove that nothing, not even blood, would shake his loyalty to the monarchy. He chose the latter. But here's where the contradiction lies. Those who know William say he wasn't indifferent. They say his silence wasn't cruelty, but paralysis. Imagine being torn in half. One side a grieving brother, the other side the future king. To act on one side is to betray the other. And in that moment, William may have realized something devastating. That his brother was no longer his equal, no longer his partner, no longer even his family. Harry had become the enemy of the crown, and William's loyalty to the crown had to come first. Still, insiders whisper that William's private torment after the announcement was unbearable. Behind closed doors, away from cameras, he was said to be pale, withdrawn, haunted. He didn't collapse like Harry, but something inside him cracked. Because William knows better than anyone the price of duty. He knows what it's like to sacrifice love for responsibility, to bury personal pain for the sake of image. And watching Harry collapse reminded him of the boy he once was. The boy who lost his mother and clung to his brother for survival. That memory lingered, not at him, even as he forced his public mask to remain intact. But the palace machine doesn't allow for hesitation. Silence, to the world, became complicity. William's lack of defense was read not as conflict, but as condemnation. In that moment, he wasn't seen as Harry's brother. He was seen as Charles's son, the dutiful heir who would inherit the throne without flinching. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how the palace wanted it. Let me ask you this. What would you have done in William's place? Step forward and risk undermining your father, the king? Or stay silent, watching your only brother collapse, knowing your silence could break him forever? William's choice cut deeper than any words could have. It sent a message, not just to Harry, but to the entire world, that brotherhood ends where the crown begins. And for Harry, that silence was almost as devastating as the announcement itself. Because in his collapse, he may have still believed his brother would rush to his side. But when William stayed rooted to the spot, arms crossed, lips sealed, Harry understood the truth. The bond was gone, and Charles knew it. The king had been waiting for this moment, testing his sons, pushing them apart, ensuring that William chose duty over loyalty. And when William didn't intervene, Charles saw victory. The heir was secure. The spare was erased. But here's the twist. William's silence didn't end the pain. It ignited it. Because whispers began to circulate. Whispers that William had played a larger role in convincing Charles to take the final step. That William, the dutiful son, had urged his father to cut Harry off once and for all. True or not, the rumor spread like wildfire. And for Harry, the thought that his own brother had sharpened the knife was a betrayal too deep to bear. The collapse was personal. The silence was devastating. But when William finally spoke, the words he chose weren't to defend his brother. They were something else entirely. And when William finally spoke, it wasn't to defend Harry. It was to defend the crown. King Charles has always been a man of contradictions. A son who lived in the shadow of a disapproving father. A husband who never stopped loving another woman. A monarch who waited longer than any heir in history to wear the crown. And now, finally king, he faced his own test. What to do about the son who had become his greatest liability. To understand why Charles disowned Harry, You have to understand the cold logic of a man who has lived his entire life under the crushing weight of one truth. The crown comes before everything, even before blood. Imagine carrying that burden. For 70 years, Charles knew his every action, every word, every decision would one day be judged as the choices of a king. He endured ridicule, scandal, mockery, even being branded unfit, because he believed one thing with unwavering certainty: the monarchy must survive. And when Harry went rogue, tearing holes in the family's image, Charles made his choice. He chose crown over child. But here's the thing. This wasn't easy. Sources close to Charles say he wrestled with the decision for months, maybe years. There were attempts at reconciliation, private phone calls, awkward family meetings. But Harry didn't stop. The Oprah interview, the Netflix documentary, the memoir Spare. Each revelation was like a dagger aimed at the heart of the monarchy. Allegations of racism, stories of neglect, accusations that the royal family had failed to protect Meghan from cruelty. These weren't just criticisms. They were attacks on the very image Charles was desperate to preserve. Now, ask yourself, how long can a monarch tolerate rebellion from within before the institution begins to crumble? Charles's advisors warned him again and again. Harry's outbursts weren't just family drama. They were destabilizing the crown itself. Public sympathy was shifting. Younger generations saw Harry as a truth-teller, a rebel against an archaic system. And in a world where the monarchy survives only because people believe in it, that was fatal. So Charles began to harden. The father in him may have still hoped for reconciliation, but the king in him saw no choice. And when the moment came, he spoke not as a parent, but as a sovereign, no longer recognized. The words were cold, deliberate, merciless. They weren't meant to express love or regret. They were meant to draw a line in stone. Here's the contradiction. Charles himself had once been the rebel, the misunderstood prince, the man mocked by tabloids, vilified by the public, rejected for loving the woman he truly cared for. He knew what it felt like to be cast out. And yet, when faced with his own son's rebellion, he chose to wield the very cruelty he once endured. That's the tragedy of Charles. He became the thing he once despised. And then there's Camilla. Insiders whisper that her influence loomed large over this decision. Camilla, who had fought tooth and nail for decades to be accepted, who had weathered storms of public hatred, who finally claimed her place as queen. To her, Harry's rebellion wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. Every time Harry invoked Diana's memory, every time he painted Charles as cold or unfit, it reopened old wounds. Wounds that directly threatened Camilla's hard-won legitimacy. Some say she pushed Charles to act, to cut the cord once and for all. Let me ask you this. Was Charles protecting the crown or protecting Camilla? Maybe both. Maybe he saw no difference. Because for Charles, love has always been tangled with duty. And in his cold calculus, Harry's disownment wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But survival comes at a cost. In choosing the crown, Charles revealed his deepest flaw, the inability to separate family from monarchy. To him, Harry wasn't just a son. He was a liability. And liabilities are to be cut off. But did Charles consider the ripple effect? Did he foresee the collapse, the outrage, the fury? Or did he simply decide that no price was too high to preserve the throne? This is where it gets darker. Because sources claim Charles's announcement carried an unspoken warning, not just for Harry, but for Meghan too. No longer recognized wasn't just about titles or bloodlines. It was about influence, about silencing a narrative that threatened to destabilize the monarchy. The message was clear. If you cross the crown will erase you. And yet, here lies the cruel irony. In erasing Harry, Charles only amplified him. The disownment made Harry a global symbol of betrayal, a modern exile. It was meant to destroy his credibility. Instead, it immortalized his suffering. And Charles, for all his cold logic, may have underestimated just how much the world would recoil at the image of a father disowning his son. But Charles didn't act blindly. He believed he had the heir on his side. William had stood silent, proving his loyalty. Camilla's support was unwavering. And the stoic princess approved. And the courtiers, the faceless architects of monarchy, were thrilled. From their perspective, Harry was no longer a threat. The family was unified. The crown was secure. Or was it? Because while Charles thought he had ended the chaos, The world outside the palace walls was reacting with shock, fury, and heartbreak. And the backlash was about to engulf the monarchy in a storm it couldn't control. But the king's words weren't just about Harry. They carried a warning from Meghan too. The world erupted. Within minutes of King Charles's brutal declaration, the palace gates were swarmed by cameras, reporters, and protesters holding hastily scribbled signs. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #StandWithHarry, #ShameOnCharles, and #InTheMonarchy trended globally. For many, the disownment wasn't just shocking, it was unforgivable. How could a father disown his son so publicly, so mercilessly, so coldly? News outlets from London to Los Angeles ran nonstop coverage. Every second of Harry's collapse was replayed, dissected, slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. Some anchors wept openly on live television. Others leaned into outrage, condemning the monarchy as heartless, outdated, even cruel. And yet, there were voices, particularly from staunch royalists, who applauded Charles's decisiveness, framing Harry as reckless, selfish, and deserving of his fate. The world wasn't just watching, it was dividing. Ask yourself, when has a family feud last split nations? When has one father's rejection of his son triggered protests in foreign capitals? That's the power of the Windsors. Their drama isn't just personal. It's political, cultural, and symbolic. And this act of disownment, carried out in the public eye, ignited debates far beyond palace walls. In Britain, the streets outside Buckingham Palace became a battleground. On one side, protesters cried out for compassion, holding up photos of Diana and accusing Charles of repeating history's cruelty. On the other, loyalists waved Union Jacks, chanting that the monarchy must come first, no matter the cost. The scene was chaos, tears, cheers, jeers, all unfolding in the shadow of a gilded palace. Across the Atlantic, America rallied to Harry and Meghan's side. Hollywood stars, political figures, and activists denounced the announcement. Oprah's camp hinted at another sit-down interview. Late-night hosts roasted Charles, portraying him as cold and unfeeling. Even some U.S. politicians weighed in, framing the disownment as a human rights issue. In Meghan's homeland, the monarchy's cruelty only amplified the couple's martyrdom. But here's the twist. While parts of the world wept for Harry, others saw Charles's move as necessary. In conservative corners of the UK, callers on radio shows praised the king's resolve. Tabloid headlines screamed about Harry's disloyalty, framing the disownment as long overdue. To them, Charles had defended the crown. To critics, he had destroyed his family. The backlash didn't stop with the public. International media turned on the monarchy. European outlets likened the announcement to medieval banishment. African commentators questioned the morality of a system that clings to colonial-era traditions while disowning its own blood. In Australia and Canada, Republicans seized the moment to call for independence from the crown altogether. The tremors of this one announcement reached every corner of the Commonwealth. And what about inside Britain's own walls of power? Parliament couldn't ignore it. MPs debated whether the monarchy had crossed a line. Was Charles still fit to reign with compassion? Or had he revealed a cruelty that would forever taint his legacy? Let's not forget the emotional response. Diana's name surged to the forefront of global conversation. People remembered her interviews, her tears, her warnings about the firm. And now, her son, publicly broken, was seen as the ultimate victim of the very system that had once crushed her. For millions, it wasn't just Harry collapsing. It was Diana collapsing all over again. But here's where it gets complicated. The palace didn't panic at the backlash. They expected it. In fact, some insiders suggest they welcomed it. Why? Because chaos divides. And in division, the crown survives. For every protester screaming for Harry, there was another praising Charles's strength. The monarchy thrives in polarization. It feeds on loyalty, and loyalty is forged in the fires of conflict. Still, the backlash was relentless. Polls shifted. Approval ratings for Charles dipped sharply. Younger generations declared their disgust. And yet, William's silence became the monarchy's saving grace. While Charles took the heat, William's stoicism reassured traditionalists that the future of the crown remained strong. The heir was untouchable. The spare was expendable. But in the middle of this global firestorm, one figure emerged from the shadows with surprising influence: the queen consort. Camilla, long painted as the villain of Diana's story, suddenly found herself in a position of power. Whispers spread that she had shaped the decision, that her hand guided Charles toward finality. And when Camilla's name entered the conversation, the backlash turned even more venomous. Because for many, Harry wasn't just disowned by his father. He was betrayed by his father's wife. And just when the world thought it couldn't get worse, the queen consort stepped in. Camilla sat quietly during the announcement. No tears, no hesitation. Just a subtle tightening of her lips, the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes, so brief you might miss it if you weren't looking closely. To the outside world, she seemed the loyal queen consort, standing by her king. But to those who know how the palace operates, her presence was more than symbolic, it was strategic. Because behind the curtain, whispers say Camilla's hand guided this entire disownment. Think about her history. For decades, Camilla was cast as the villain, the other woman, the shadow haunting Diana. She endured public hatred, tabloid venom, even being branded the most hated woman in Britain. But she survived. Slowly, carefully, she rebuilt her image. She outlasted scandal, outmaneuvered critics, and eventually ascended to the role of queen consort. That survival wasn't luck, it was calculation. Camilla knows how the palace game is played. She knows that perception is power. And Harry, loud, rebellious, forever invoking Diana, threatened everything she had clawed her way to achieve. Ask yourself, how could Camilla ever truly forgive Harry? In his memoir, Spare, he called her dangerous, accusing her of leaking stories to the press to bolster her image. He claimed she sacrificed him to rehabilitate herself. Those words weren't just stabs in the dark. They were wounds to her reputation, carefully rebuilt after decades of venom. And for Camilla, reputation is survival. So when Charles deliberated about Harry, do you think she stayed silent? Or do you think she reminded him, gently but firmly, that a son who branded his stepmother a villain was a son who could not remain in the fold? Here's the irony. Camilla, once painted as the homewrecker, is now queen. Harry, once a beloved prince, is now disowned. The tables have turned. And some suggest she engineered that reversal, not with obvious commands, but with whispers. A word here, a reminder there. Quiet pressure applied until Charles convinced himself it was his idea all along. That is Camilla's skill, to move in shadows, to wield influence without appearing to grasp it. Now let's talk about Diana. Because Diana's ghost hangs over every decision this family makes. For Camilla, Diana's memory is both a curse and a threat. Every time Harry speaks, he invokes his mother. Every accusation he makes about cruelty or neglect drags Diana's story back into the light. And who stands at the center of that story? Camilla. So long as Harry has a platform, Diana's ghost stalks Camilla's throne. By silencing him, by disowning him, Camilla doesn't just protect the monarchy. She protects herself. But here's the darker possibility. What if Camilla wasn't just protecting her image? What if she was settling a score? Diana once described her marriage as crowded with 3 people. For years, Camilla was mocked, shamed, pushed into the shadows while Diana basked in the world's love. And now, Diana's son, the boy who adored her, had grown into the man attacking Camilla's legitimacy. Could this disownment be Camilla's final act of revenge? Not against Diana herself, but against her legacy? Insiders whisper that Camilla's role went beyond influence. Some say she personally met with advisors, urging them to compile the files on Harry and Meghan. Others claim she persuaded Charles by painting Harry as a threat to William's future, reminding him that the monarchy couldn't afford 2 competing narratives. Whether true or not, the rumors spread fast, and each rumor only deepened public suspicion. Let me ask you, do you think Camilla, after clawing her way to the throne, would allow anyone, even her husband's son, to jeopardize it? Or do you believe she would do whatever it took to secure her place in history, even if it meant erasing Harry? And yet, the more her name surfaced in whispers, the more dangerous the backlash became. Because Camilla's past isn't clean. She carries the weight of old scandals, old betrayals. And tying her name to Harry's disownment risked dragging all of that back into the spotlight. Already, commentators began reviving stories of Diana's tears, Charles's infidelity, and Camilla's role in the most infamous royal love triangle in history. By inserting herself into Harry's downfall, Camilla reopened wounds that had never truly healed. But maybe that was the risk she was willing to take. To her, better to be seen as ruthless and victorious than weak and vulnerable. Better to control the narrative, even if it meant igniting fury, than to let Harry continue dismantling the monarchy piece by piece. The world saw Charles read the words. But behind those words, Camilla's shadow loomed large. The queen consort, no longer content to be the villain of the past, had become the architect of the present. And yet, Camilla wasn't the only voice in Charles's ear. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that the monarchy thrives on exile. And Harry's disownment wasn't just about family, it was about tradition. A tradition of banishment stretching back generations. And soon, the world would see that Harry's fate wasn't unique. It was history repeating itself. But Camilla wasn't the only royal whispering in Charles's ear. Exile. It's a word that drips with history, one that has haunted monarchies for centuries. Kings have exiled rivals. Queens have banished courtiers. And in the Windsor dynasty, exile is practically a family tradition. Harry's disownment may feel shocking in the modern age, but it's not new. It's the echo of a pattern, an institution that has always sacrificed its own when survival demands it. Let's rewind. The year was 1936. King Edward VIII abdicated the throne to Mary Wallace Simpson, the American divorcee the crown refused to accept. What happened to him afterward? Exile. He was shipped off to France, paraded as a cautionary tale, stripped of his power and dignity. He lived out his life far from the throne, forever marked as the royal who chose love over duty. Does that sound familiar? A man cast aside for loving an American woman? History doesn't repeat itself, it roars back with vengeance. And Edward wasn't the only one. Princess Margaret, the Queen's own sister, faced the threat of exile when she dared to love group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man the crown deemed unacceptable. She was forced to choose, love or crown. She chose the crown, but the wound never healed. Her life became a slow decline, smothered by protocol, her heart forever broken. The pattern is clear. When love clashes with the monarchy, love loses, or the person in love is banished. Now Harry joins that line of tragic figures. But his exile is harsher. Edward abdicated by choice. Margaret chose duty. Harry was forced out. Exiled not because he wanted to leave, but because the monarchy wanted him gone. That's the cruelty of it. This wasn't his decision. It was Charles's decree. The monarchy decided that his existence, his voice, his rebellion, was too dangerous to tolerate. And let's not forget Diana. Though not exiled in the literal sense, she was cast out in spirit. Stripped of her royal highness, hounded by the press, left unprotected by the very institution she gave her youth to serve. Diana's exile ended in tragedy, and now her son, the boy who walked behind her coffin, finds himself following in her footsteps, not just rejected, but erased. Ask yourself, why does the monarchy repeat this cycle? Why does it keep banishing its own? The answer is simple. Because the crown survives not on love, but on control. Anyone who threatens that control must be neutralized. If history has taught us anything, it's that the monarchy fears nothing more than a free voice within its own bloodline. Harry was too free, too outspoken, too willing to defy, and so he became expendable. But here's the contradiction. Every time the monarchy exiles one of its own, it creates a martyr. Edward became a symbol of love. Margaret became a symbol of sacrifice. Diana became a symbol of compassion and rebellion. And now Harry, his collapse, his disownment, his exile, it cements him as a tragic figure, a man destroyed by the very crown he was born to serve. In trying to erase him, the monarchy only made him unforgettable, and the world sees the parallels. Commentators draw comparisons on every channel. This is Edward all over again. Harry is Diana's son in every way. History repeats itself because the Windsors never learn. The narrative is set. The monarchy sacrifices its own for survival. And with every repetition, it loses more of its humanity. But let's go deeper. Because Harry's exile carries a crueler twist. Edward lost his throne, but he kept his dignity. Margaret lost her love, but she kept her title. Diana lost her marriage, but she kept the world's sympathy. Harry? He's lost everything. his family, his titles, his role, even his recognition as a Windsor. The exile this time is absolute. It's not just banishment. It's erasure. Now consider Meghan in this parallel. Like Wallis Simpson before her, she's cast as the temptress, the outsider, the reason for rebellion. The press paints her as the villain, just as they did with Wallis. And the Crown uses her as justification. He chose her, and so he must suffer. But the truth is far more complex. Meghan, like Wallis, became the excuse. The real issue isn't the woman, it's the system. A system that cannot tolerate individuality, love, or freedom when it threatens the hierarchy. Let me ask you, is Harry's exile really about Meghan? Or is Meghan simply the convenient scapegoat for a decision the monarchy had been preparing for years? The exile parallel doesn't just explain Harry's fate. It predicts what comes next. Because every exile creates consequences. Edward lived in bitterness, forever criticizing the family that cast him out. Margaret sank into despair, drowning in loneliness. Diana's exile ended in tragedy that nearly toppled the monarchy itself. What will Harry's exile unleash? Could his downfall ignite the very collapse of the institution Charles is desperate to protect? And here's where it turns darker. Because unlike Edward, Margaret, or even Diana, Harry has a weapon they never did: the modern media. Platforms, documentaries, memoirs, podcasts. Harry has the power to tell his story in his own words, to reach millions without the filter of the palace. That makes him dangerous in a way no exiled royal before him ever was. And that's exactly why his exile had to be absolute. The monarchy thinks it has silenced him. But history shows that every exile eventually speaks louder than the crown. Yet for all the parallels, for all the echoes of history, Harry's exile holds one unique torment. The person he trusted most to stand by him, his wife Meghan, would soon push him into a choice that tore him apart all over again. Because Meghan wasn't done fighting, and her ultimatum would change everything. Harry's exile had a crueler twist, the stripping of blood itself.